The life of Pravin Gordhan presents an interesting and important opportunity to reflect not only on the liberation struggle, the ANC's period in government, its successes, but also its failures. What does his life represent, and how can we look at it beyond some of the binary narratives that we have received so far? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. My name is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and if you're new around here, this channel is where we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. Now, a lot going on in our country, but of course, one of the main things dominating headlines has been the sad death of Pravin Gordhan, a former minister, an anti-apartheid activist, and also a former commissioner of SARS. Now, this event has sparked quite a divisive narrative on many different extremes in our country. And what I'd like to do is take a step back from that and reflect on the life of Gordhan, because I think it's an important life in South Africa's political history, a life that explains so much of what is right about South Africa and its liberation struggle, but also a lot of what has gone wrong, particularly in the ANC's tenure in government. Now, I know that for members of his family, for example, it's still quite fresh that he has passed away. And, I send them my deepest sympathies and condolences. It's never a good thing to lose someone who's close to you. And I'm sure that they're all suffering right now. And so I send them those thoughts and prayers. Gordhan, of course, though, was a public figure. And so when you are a public figure, it's important to reflect on your public life when you pass away, because Gordhan's life goes beyond his immediate family connections, and it's a life that has affected South Africa's politics and its government in so many different ways. And I just get the feeling like his life is not being given the complexity it deserves, and there are these binary narratives. I saw a shout out to friend of the show, JJ Tabane, reflecting on this, that you either have to think that Pravin Gordhan was this incredible, heroic angel who never did anything wrong, or you have to think that he was this demon who did everything wrong and never did anything right. But I think the truth of this matter is that where we look into the successes and the high points and also the failures of Gordhan's public life, we actually learn quite a lot about South African society. And I do think we have to have an honest conversation about his public life, one that doesn't swing to either of the extremes. So I'd like to do that because I actually learned quite a lot that I didn't know about Pravin Gordhan in this moment, where people have been talking about his contributions and his life, and recency bias tends to affect the way we look at public figures. But I also think that there are important interventions and contributions that he made, and important mistakes that he made that need to be considered. And so I'd like to do that here today. The first thing I'd like to do is have a look at Gordhan's early life and his life in activism. Then I want to look at after 1994 and the period into SARS, which I think is really a high point of his career and an important symbol for good governance in South Africa. Thereafter, I want to look at where things started to go slightly wrong. Now, there was a period of, in some ways, persecution, some say, certainly him being removed from various offices in the Zuma presidency, and him really becoming a symbol of the resistance against the Zuma presidency in South Africa in its second term. Then finally, I want to look at the period under the Ramaphosa presidency, where there was great hope invested in rebuilding state-owned enterprises. And I want to suggest that Gordhan's tenure there was a crushing disappointment. So eventually what I want to show is that Gordhan's life is really important. He did important work at SARS. He was key to, for example, the Constitutional Committee in Parliament, in the anti-apartheid movement, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. But he also made some mistakes which he acknowledged, which have led to a really harrowing experience with state-owned enterprises that has existed long after the Zuma presidency, which he so strongly criticized. And then to say that none of us is perfect, and the way we should look at public figures, unless they, are like apartheid leaders and they've done terrible things, is in this complexity. So let's begin with his early life. Gordhan is born in Durban to an Indian middle-class family in 1949. And this is an important year because, of course, apartheid in all its horror had begun just the year before. So all of his life up until 94 was lived inside of the apartheid state. And he attended a school reserved only for Indians, quote unquote, by apartheid categories, and eventually found his way to university at the University of Durban, Westville, also an apartheid created or an institution which apartheid reserved for certain races. But it's clear that at this time, as he was coming of age at university, he began to develop political consciousness and began to get involved in student activism, which was such an important cradle of activism in South Africa. And this was a key time in South African life, the 1970s. And these were the early 1970s where the ideas of Black consciousness were beginning to permeate South African campuses. And there was an increasing radicalization of students against the apartheid system. ANC leaders, the ANC had been banned. It was very difficult for them to find a foothold again in the South African body politic. And so a new generation of student leaders was rising at the time. This was happening at Turfloop University with people like Onkgopotse Tiro, of course Steve Biko was key to this, but of course as well in Natal, now KwaZulu-Natal, there were important movements, and Gordhan was a key part of that. He actually became SRC, I think he was SRC president, or he was part of the SRC for sure, in 1971. And there were increasing boycott movements in 1971 and 1972, which student leaders were using to speak about the wider society outside the university. And this is a lesson I think that student leaders should continue to learn, that university politics is not just about universities, but it's about how the university uses its position to also speak about the society. And this is what the great university leaders of that period were able to do. They took their SRCs, they took their campus movements, and then they went into society to fight against apartheid. So this was an important contribution of Gordhan's. Now, the Natal Indian Congress was an important organization around this time for the following reason. The ANC had been banned, but in an era, the apartheid government had not banned the Natal Indian Congress, which was actually a body that was founded by, amongst other leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, of all people, who came to South Africa and lived in South Africa in the late 19th century, and founded this organization along with others. Initially a passive resistance movement, it ended up gravitating towards the African National Congress and forming alliances with the Congress of Democrats, the ANC, and the National Indian Congress. So because this body wasn't banned, many of the Indian leaders at the time in KwaZulu-Natal went back and formed part of this body, but it was always understood that it was also linked to the ANC. But the benefit was that this body was not a banned organization up until that point. And Gordhan, from university, then played a key role in this institution, which was leading mass campaigns out of the early 70s into the mid-70s and 80s. And eventually this organization also finds its way into the United Democratic Front, which is the mass movement in the 1980s, which really puts the ultimate form of public pressure on the apartheid state. Now, between the period of the UDF's formation and his joining the National Indian Congress, Gordhan increasingly gets dragged and brought into the ANC underground structures and eventually parts of Umkhonto weSizwe, although not as a combatant, fulfilling certain tasks for the ANC's military wing. And former President Jacob Zuma recently referred in quite affectionate terms to when he met Gordhan, and Gordhan was part of an operation which took former President Zuma to what was then Swaziland, where he met with Thabo Mbeki. Watch my interview on Zuma's relationship with Mbeki, where I go into the history of that friendship and the breakup of that friendship. So there's no doubt that Gordhan was a very brave person, fought against apartheid through the anti-apartheid movement, and got increasingly deeply involved in very dangerous operations. And he was detained many times, largely in the 80s. He suffered solitary confinement, and this is something that I've heard about through my father, who also went through that experience when he was detained in the 80s. And so you know that people sacrificed and they gave a lot in the fight against apartheid. So Gordhan clearly played an important role here. Now, as we build towards the UDF moment and the UDF period, this is in some ways a high point for the mass democratic struggle. ANC is slowly winning the international fight. Unbanning is becoming closer. But while the ANC is banned, South Africa still needs a popular front to put mass pressure on the apartheid movement through rolling mass action and protest. And you will have seen that moment in South African life. There were states of emergency, there was massive protest, there was increasing violence. The United Democratic Front really became the central organization in that. And Gordhan is in Natal at the time a key member of that movement and increasingly in national government. Now, an interesting wrinkle in this story is that as often happens in liberation movements, tensions began to develop between the UDF and some members of the ANC, which has always had many different wings. And a more radical wing of the ANC was beginning to question the influence of Indian and white South African activists in the mass democratic movement, and suggesting that in some ways the ambitions of the black African majority were being subordinated or diluted through the activity of Indian activists in this movement. And this group of important and brave Indian activists were branded as some of them white as well, and some of them black African, as a cabal within the UDF that had really broken away from the core concerns of the black radical tradition within the ANC. I think the thing to say here is these were serious. These fights were serious, and you know, within the ANC, I grew up in the ANC, and you must know that the ANC is a family, but it's a very fractious family. And everyone in the ANC has a conspiracy theory about everyone else in the ANC. And so there were these internal family fights, and they got quite acrimonious at times. And so these camps developed and they broke apart. There was tension between the exiles and the UDF group. There was tension between a more black radicalist tradition and a more reconciliatory tradition. So there have always been these kind of tensions within the ANC. There's nothing new about that. Anyway, the mass democratic movement ultimately finds a way to resolve its differences, largely under the banner of the ANC, and we get the democratic breakthrough in 1994. So let's come to the second part of this now, which is really about Gordhan and being a government leader and an effective government leader and the commission of an important state institution like SARS. So Gordhan is part of the negotiations, the CODESA moment, the Constituent Assembly, and then the first Parliament. And he also plays quite an important role before he moves over into SARS in constitutional affairs here. In 1994, he plays an important role in the Constitutional Committee. And this is an important committee because the Constitution is being drafted, one of the first tasks of that 1994 government is to take the constitution and midwife the constitution between 1994 and 1996. And then after 1996, of course, you set up a constitutional committee where Parliament has to monitor the growth, the birth of the constitution, and then take any changes or amendments that should happen, and take views from society into the Parliament and consider them. And Gordhan is quite an important role player in this whole early constitutional moment. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. But then in 1999, so after the first term of Parliament, Gordhan is then moved and deployed by the ANC to be the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service. And of course, this is a key role in the economy, and SARS and the South African economy are still trying to rebuild from the period of apartheid destruction of the economy. Never forget that the economy was in a very bad way when the ANC took over. Massive debt. The state was only catering to a small minority of the people, and so SARS also had to in some ways be democratized. So Gordhan is widely lauded for his role in SARS in bringing clean governance to that institution, but also in making it an effective revenue collections agency and just getting the revenue that the South African state needed for its developmental programs. And Gordhan ends up running SARS for 10 years, and he really receives universal plaudits for the job that he did there, and for making sure that SARS itself had healthy financial governance, that tax revenue was going up, and that corruption was kept to a minimum within SARS. So he's widely praised for that, at least up until the time that he leaves. There are some controversies after that, but this seems to be, at least in terms of his political career, an important kind of golden era, as it were. Now, he spends 10 years at SARS, and then he comes back, and he comes back as a minister, and he comes back as Minister of Finance, funnily enough, brought back by former President Jacob Zuma, his old friend from the ANC underground. And with the events that transpired after this, it's funny to remember and ironic to remember that Gordhan and Zuma initially emerged onto the scene as allies, and it was Zuma who brought Gordhan into the highest levels of government as Minister of Finance in 2009. And Gordhan's reputation is strong. He's seen as a firm financial hand. And in the first Zuma term, roughly, he serves as Minister of Finance, and he doesn't really do much different to the former ministries of finance. Of course, we had the 2008 financial crisis, so he had some serious headwinds to face. South African economy is not doing that well. It's not doing that badly. Some argue that there was too much government spending, which got us into all these deficits and debt-fueled spending. But largely, the budgets are looked at as and they're lauded. But now we come to part 3, because this is where things start to change. And initially, Gordhan is seen as a persecuted figure, and there may well be some truth to that view. But then after that, he fails to cash in a lot of the symbolic importance that he has assumed in actually changing state-owned enterprises, and largely fails as Minister of Public Enterprises to really set state-owned enterprises on a new trajectory. So most South Africans will never forget. We wake up around about 2014, and and Pravin Gordhan, who's been Minister of Finance for a while from then, is removed. He's removed from his position and he's put into the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Ministry. And there is public outcry. The markets don't like it. Big business doesn't like it. And Gordhan is then a few days later reinstalled into the position of Minister of Finance, or a while later. I believe it was actually in December 2015 that he goes back. So he goes back to Minister of Finance because markets have confidence in him. But it's never quite the same. And clearly there was some kind of break between him and President Zuma. Gordhan alleges that he resisted state capture. Zuma alleged that Gordhan was part of some kind of plot to remove him. And the two really never saw eye to eye after that. And as we roll into 2016, it seems like state institutions, the hawks, are now starting to place great focus and emphasis on Gordhan, and he is saying he's under pressure and he's getting these questions that he has to answer from law enforcement agencies, maintaining his innocence. And so it's clear there's some kind of serious showdown on the horizon. And then in early 2017, he's once again recalled as Minister of Finance. So there's a big break. Gordhan is removed once again. This is in the build-up to the ANC's NASREC conference, where Cyril Ramaphosa eventually became triumphant. But he stays in Parliament, even though he's not a minister, and he asks some very probing questions of state-owned enterprises while he's there. Now, it's interesting to note that at this time, one of his biggest defenders was Julius Malema. The EFF was very critical of Zuma's decision to remove Gordhan, and they linked this to the Gupta-led project to really take control of the South African state. And once you can take control of Treasury, then all the treasure at the disposal of the South African government becomes yours. So Gordhan was seen as this figure who resisted or was persecuted because of a state capture interest. However, the story takes another turn, and now I want to come into the period after Zuma in the ANC, the period of President Cyril Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa decides he wants to bring Gordhan back into the fold. And this time, he very symbolically appoints Gordhan as Minister of Public Enterprises. Now, Gordhan had gone on record as saying he was fighting state capture, that a lot of the state capture had happened in public enterprises. So there was a great deal of faith placed into him as he went back into public enterprises. And the idea is that he would be Mr. Clean Up. He would restore the dignity of these institutions, get them back onto a firm financial footing. And the new dawn would largely be led by Ramaphosa and Gordhan, who at that time were really darlings of the South African media who could do no wrong. But perhaps this is where the story takes a bit of a turn, because I do think it has to be said that Gordhan's tenure as Minister of Public Enterprises was at the very least underwhelming. He really failed to turn Eskom around. And in fact, Eskom plunged into an even deeper crisis. And Gordhan, when asked, and shout out to Tsidi Madia, who did a great interview with Gordhan, I think it's the last interview we have, and asked about this, he was forced to admit that some of the appointments made at Eskom, particularly Andre de Ruyter's tenure, were a disappointment. And I want you to have a look at what he said about that in this clip over here in his chat with Tsidi Madia.
That issue of Eskom and the outputs and...
Yeah, I think there's no regrets, but we should have been more observant about what a person like Andre de Ruyter was up to. where too much of the focus was on renewables and traveling around the world and selling that, and not enough courage to tackle some of the problems that have more recently been tackled. And obviously, a book was written at the same time as being managed, at the same time as managing Eskom, including what kind of samosas he had at my humble house. But with that kind of management, it shows that the focus was wrong. We gave him too much of a lead time, or rather lag, or a leash. But then some of these things you don't recognize at the moment. I'm not an engineer. I've learnt a lot. I can ask you questions. I'll be able to pick up when you are talking nonsense to me. But ultimately, it's they that have to do the job. And there's no doubt, the climate that was created by state capture is very toxic, because you have a whole range of syndicates that are operating. And we haven't done well enough, although we are coming to terms with it now, in some ways, on the law enforcement side and putting people into orange uniforms.
Look, Gordhan there is, as any good politician, really underplaying how bad things got when he was Minister of Public Enterprises. Eskom experienced its worst performance. Andre de Ruyter's tenure will unfortunately be remembered as a tragic chapter in South African development for the depth and the crisis of load shedding. And things got worse, not better. Now, Transnet fell into absolute disrepair. Denel, the same story. And so, although Gordhan promised, and although President Ramaphosa professed that there would be this swift turnaround, we got this story that, it turns out things are going to take longer than we thought, or the corruption was worse than we initially envisaged. And I don't really buy this argument. The fact is that as Minister of Finance, the question I've always had, and remember that I say, and I've spoken about the important contributions that Gordhan made, but one question I've always had for those leaders in the ANC who style themselves as the people who fought state capture is, how didn't you see it coming earlier? Why did you find out with the rest of South Africans that this happened? I don't believe anyone could have sat in that cabinet and not seen that there was a problem. And unfortunately, some of these leaders had to choose between their loyalty to the ANC and disclosing things in public which would have embarrassed the ANC significantly. And either they didn't tell the public soon enough, or they turned a blind eye, or they tried to protect their comrades. And I asked Cyril Ramaphosa, what did he know in that cabinet? And has he told us everything he knew? And I asked the same question to Minister Gordhan. So there's no way that they could not have known what was going on inside these state-owned enterprises. And unfortunately, people are judged not only on their intentions, but on the outcomes. And the outcomes of the period that Gordhan served in public enterprises were disastrous. Now, Gordhan may have been fighting, he may have been trying to do things. His view was that, it takes a long time, as he says, to recapture an institution. But unfortunately, he was part of the same party that was part of what he calls capture in the first place. So this idea that you can disentangle some people in the ANC that were fighting capture and others that were perpetuating it is a little outlandish to me. It's one party, one government, and those who serve that government and who benefit from serving that government should take accountability for what the entire government does. You can't break apart you can't take one slice of the cake away and imagine that, it's not connected to the entire cake. The ANC government brought us these failures, and Gordhan was a key part of that government. for many, many years, both in the Zuma and Ramaphosa eras. So I do think that we have to reflect critically on some of the anticlimaxes of his time at public enterprises. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. Although what I will also say in closing is that as questions of his legacy, which have gone into deeper questions about where South Africa is in this moment, have surfaced after his death, and again, I say may his soul rest in peace, and I really don't believe in intentionally speaking ill of the dead. But it has raised quite a divisive debate, because there are those who say that, Gordhan represents all that is bad about South Africa. And then there are those who say that, he's this perfect angel. And there's been this acrimonious fight. The EFF released a statement where they said, I must try and get the wording right here, that they note his death without a pretense of sorrow. And I think that, is not in the best taste. Someone has just died, their family's grieving. And even if you didn't agree with them politically, and to be sure, Gordhan went on the attack on the EFF just as they went on the attack on him. That's just not, it's not the right tone to strike at a time when there's a grieving family, right? At the same time, when Gordhan's friends in the ANC saw that, they unleashed all kinds of attacks on the EFF. And I saw Trevor Manuel coming out and saying the EFF, only criticized Gordhan because they are funded by cigarette smugglers and they are corrupt and all of that. And I don't think South Africans are in either of those two camps. I think, but when I look at the media narrative, it's almost like, the South African media knows how to do a hero story, right? So now we have all these somber reflections on how Gordhan was this perfect figure and perfect individual, and neither of the two are true. He made mistakes, very important mistakes, but he also did really great things, and we need to move away from calling people either heroes or villains, because at different times people can be heroes and at different times they can be villains, and sometimes they're both at once. And I think Gordhan represents the complexity of South Africa's failure to deal with its developmental challenges. He represents an important strand of ethical government because he was never found to have been corrupt, even though he held very important offices. But he also represents a certain sense in which the delivery of the South African government to its people has failed to overcome the crises of apartheid and corruption and maladministration. And so, as we reflect on Gordhan, but also this period in South African politics, we should hold out both a hope for good leaders and good governance, but also a certain critical eye to the fact that we have not achieved the goals we have set out for ourselves as a country. So, Lala Ngoxolo, Pravin Gordhan, and I hope this reflection on his life and its wider implications for South African politics has given you a deeper understanding of his contributions to South Africa's public landscape. Ayeye.